ATC e-learning center wants to make a net profit of $650,000 on the manual it sells to schools. The fixed costs for producing the manual are $780,000 and the variable cost per package is $19.85. If the estimated unit sales are 1,250,000 units, what selling price per unit should ATCE try? Okay, so they know what profit they want to make. They know their fixed cost, they know their variable their variable cost per package, and they have a good estimate of their unit sales. So they want to know, based on this information, what should they sell each unit for? Okay, now if you go to your equations for this lesson, selling price per unit does not have an equation. Selling price per unit equals. We find selling price per unit using our possible net profit. Now remember, in the cases like this, where you don't find an equation that says whatever you're looking for equals this, look for equations that involve all of the other terms mentioned in the question, because you can always just rearrange the equation to solve for the variable you want. So for example, in this case, possible net profit equals selling price per unit minus total cost per unit multiplied by estimated unit sales. Now, net profit, fixed cost, variable cost, estimated unit sales, these are all things that are mentioned in the paragraph. So that's a good clue that although this does not actually say selling price per unit equals, it does involve that variable and it does involve other variables mentioned in the text. So my eventual goal is going to be to rearrange this equation so I can get at my selling price per unit. But before I do that, I'm going to try to figure out the value of some of these other variables. So for example, I want to know what my total cost per unit is. The equation for total cost per unit is fixed cost per unit plus variable cost per unit. So fixed cost or total cost per unit equals fixed cost per unit plus variable cost per unit. Now, fixed cost per unit equals total fixed costs over the number of units. Fixed cost per unit equals total fixed costs over the number of units. So, fixed cost per unit is equal to the fixed cost, which are $780,000, divided by the units, which are 1,250,000. So notice it would have been really easy to mix up fixed cost per unit and total fixed cost. So these are different things. Fixed costs tell us the total in all. Fixed cost per unit tell us for every unit we made, it cost us about this much. So in total, making the units cost $780,000, but per unit, that means for $780,000 for 1,250,000 units comes to about 62 cents per unit. Notice I didn't round off the 4. So, going back to my total cost per unit then, my total cost per unit would be equal to that fixed cost per unit that I just found, which was about 62 cents, 0.624, added to my variable cost per unit, which was the variable cost per unit was $19.85. So I add these two figures together and I find that my total cost per unit was $20.47. Okay, let's go back to our possible net profit equation and plug in what we know. So our possible net, and in fact we can even plug in I don't even have to write that out because we know that they want to make a net profit of $650,000. So right away I can plug in $650,000 for my possible net profit. That's going to be equal to my selling price per unit, which I'm still searching for, selling price per unit, minus my total cost per unit, and that I did solve for. So my total cost per unit came out to $20.47. I multiply that by my estimated sales, which was 1,250,000 units. So you'll notice now that I've set up a one variable equation based on my possible net profit equation, where selling price per unit is the only variable I have left, and lucky has it that this is the variable I'm trying to solve for. So from here it's a matter of attempting to isolate selling price per unit. I'll start by dividing both sides of the equation by 1,250,000. Next, let's see, so that would give us what? That would give us 52.52 is equal to our selling price per unit, our selling price per unit minus $20.47. So I add $20.47 to both sides of the equation, and I find that my selling price per unit then comes out to 52 cents plus $20.47 for a grand total of $20.99. So this is a good selling price per unit for the Learning Center to try. Again, we got here by first determining that what we were looking for was selling price per unit. Although there's not an equation for selling price per unit, we were able to look at the other items in the text and assume that possible net profit was a good equation to use, with the ultimate goal of rearranging it to solve for selling price per unit. We picked out each piece of it that we needed to solve for. So in this case, that included total cost per unit. To find total cost per unit, we first had to find fixed cost per unit. Once we had that, we went back and calculated total cost per unit. We were then able to plug in total cost per unit, estimated unit sales, and possible net profit into the possible net profit equation, finally rearranging and isolating the variable selling price per unit to solve.